Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mill Series at Lafayette College. Tonight is our third and final event for the spring semester of 2019, and I would like to welcome you all to this event. I would like to begin with a quotation from John Stuart Mill, the philosopher upon whose principles the Mill Series was founded. He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good and no one may have been able to refute them, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion, nor is it enough that he should hear the opinions of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them, and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. Tonight, we will be hosting Patrick Deneen. Patrick Deneen is an American political theorist who is a professor of political science and holds the David A. Ponzentiani Memorial College Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Deneen's interests have ranged in the areas of ancient and American political thought, democratic theory, political theology, literature and politics, and political economy. His book, Why Liberalism Failed, was fundamental in my understanding of political theory. Tonight, we hope that you engage with him. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Deneen.
Thank you, Saeed. Hearing you read that quote from John Stuart Mill, I think that's how he actually that's how he sounded. I mean, it was a beautiful, perfect British accent. So. First, I want to thank you and the Mill Society for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I lived for a number of years. You may have mentioned I taught at Princeton University, my first academic position, and would be frequently driving down to Philadelphia and would always drive by this hilltop and never stopped up here. So for me, it's the first time being here, and it's especially nice to be here because of a very old, in all senses of the word, friend, Professor Josh Miller. I can say that because I'm also getting up there. Professor Miller was a student of several major political theorists, Sheldon Wolin and John Schaar, originally having taught together at the University of California at Berkeley, and then I think you had him at University of California, Santa Cruz. At the University of California at Berkeley, they taught a graduate student who went on to become a professor at Rutgers University, where I did both my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, and who had an enormous impact. I actually name him in the beginning of the book as a thinker, a friend who passed away over 10 years ago. Actually passed away tomorrow. His anniversary of his death is March 29th. But his name was Wilson Carey McWilliams, and was one of the most brilliant and generous, in the best sense, liberal human beings ever to have lived. So I consider Professor Miller to be something of I guess an intellectual second cousin, but maybe even a little closer than that. Yeah. So, but it's delightful to spend a little time with you after many years today. So let me begin at the beginning. I want to talk about liberalism, and some of you may have been drawn here tonight, and I think maybe the warning to be nice to me was some of you might be under a false impression, which I'm going to stand here tonight and condemn liberals in the Rush Limbaugh meaning of that term. The liberals, meaning the left progressive side of the political spectrum, and I will do some of that tonight, I promise. But really what I have in my sights is the theory and practice theory of liberalism as a political philosophy that got its start several centuries ago, as well as it seems to me as the unfolding logic of liberalism as we've seen it develop in this regime and around the world in particularly Western Europe. The theory of liberalism, which is in some senses praiseworthy, in other senses problematic, was that in a world in which you had growing forms of division, especially religious division, that you would introduce a way of settling those questions by, to use the term of art, by bracketing those questions, by putting those out of the realm of public debate and instead establishing a political order in which we would sort of agree to disagree, and in which the state would patrol not the question of what was the best, correct, or right way of life, but whether or not you were acting outside of the rules of the game, whether you were interfering, seeking to impose your worldview on someone else. And so the claim was that the liberal order presented a kind of neutral order that didn't have an implicit preference for how it is that we would live our lives. In fact, in many ways, John Stuart Mill is one of the heroes of this story. John Stuart Mill's, in many ways, the passage that was read, but other passages we could read from Mill's great work on liberty, is an argument that essentially that we should all be able to pursue our individual ways of life or our collective ways of life without interference from others. This is famously known as the harm principle in John Stuart Mill's writings, that you should be able to do as you want as long as no one is getting hurt in the practice of those pursuits. This is to say that liberalism as a neutral political philosophy doesn't seek to shape us, doesn't seek to make us into a certain kind of a human being, is indifferent to that question. But what I actually want to do tonight is to call that theory into question and to actually make the argument here tonight that in a deep way, liberalism as a philosophy and as a practice, in fact, is deeply shaping of the kind of human beings that we are. And as a consequence has led to a certain kind of a society, a political order, an economic order that we're beginning to see, I think, has some really deep fundamental problems that make it ultimately unsustainable. So that's the claim I want to make tonight. So now we can go to the first slide. This slide articulates really, I think, a kernel of my thesis. This comes from a chapter of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. In order to be paid tonight, I have to speak within the first 2 minutes about Alexis de Tocqueville. This is a requirement. It's in my contract. You're probably the same, Professor Miller. You always begin with Tocqueville. This is actually from a chapter that's a favorite of conservatives. It's a chapter in which Tocqueville describes how in democratic ages people will come to prefer equality to liberty. That in some sense is given the choice, and there might always be a choice. They will come to prefer lives in which liberty recedes as long as equality is defended. Right? The perfect picture of this, if those of you are familiar with the short story written by Kurt Vonnegut called Harrison Bergeron, and if you're not familiar with it, you should be. It's a great little story. But it's about a time in which the Constitution mandates that we should all be equal. Apparently it's the 211th Amendment to the Constitution that mandated this. And it created the office of the handicapper general, whose job it is to go around handicapping anyone who's not equal. So if you're smarter than other people, you'll have to wear headphones that will scramble your thoughts. Well, we do this ourselves now, right? If you are more beautiful than someone else, you'll have to wear a mask that makes you average. If you're stronger than someone else, you'll have to wear weights that weigh you down. The devotion to equality will actually lead to a condition in which we are deprived of liberty, is the argument of that short story by Kurt Vonnegut. But in the midst of this chapter, Tocqueville makes the following statement, that in fact, one could imagine that the most complete form that equality can take on earth would be imagined as an extreme point in which freedom and equality will touch each other and intermingle. What he describes here is actually the kind of confluence of the two, what we might call is the telos of democracy toward a condition of equal liberty, in which we are equally free in some ways of each other, right? Almost that perfect Millian condition in which no one is harming anyone else. We're all free in completely an equal sense to live the lives that we wish to live. And what Tocqueville suggests is this may not be something that we see right now, immediately, but it is a kind of telos, a way in which society is directed or oriented, an endpoint to which liberal democracy inclines. Now, for Tocqueville to write this in the 1830s, after a visit to the United States of only 9 months, early 1830s, 1829, 1830, and then the publication of the first volume of Democracy in America in 1835. For him to write that this is the telos of democracy is a really remarkable thing, given that he lived in a world in which you could say the opposite was the case. He lived in a world in which equal liberty was in some ways only a theory, and a very odd theory at that. Let me go to the next slide. This is the man I'm speaking of, Alexis de Tocqueville. And one thing we can say about this man is that he lived in a world in which, among other things, you knew simply by his name that he came from a world in which equal liberty was not a thing. Right? Those of you with a little bit of French will know that this name means he's of Tocqueville. He's of the ville of Tocqueville, right? The town or village or place of the Tocquevilles, and ultimately the Tocqueville. And you can still go to this place, which is the pile of stone where Tocqueville grew up. It's actually still owned by the family. It's still the Chateau de Tocqueville. You can actually, if you have a lot of spare change, approximately about $1,000 worth of spare change, you can stay there for a night or two. In case you're out in Normandy, maybe going to visit the 75th anniversary of the Allied force landing there this summer. The estate is the location where the Tocqueville family lived and continues to live. To say you were of Tocqueville meant that you were of a place. Your name literally meant that you are defined by where you come from and from whom you come. The name indicates that you are not, in a sense, a self-making self, equally free. You are, in fact, from something, someone, someplace. Right? And if you think about the great European aristocratic names, almost all of them indicate this. If you have a little bit of German, if you're like the von Trapp family, right? That means you're of Trapp, right? The VON here substituting for the DE. I'm particularly fond of this. My name is Deneen, so I'm clearly of the house of Neen, a very noble house that has been unfortunately forgotten in the annals of history. In an aristocratic age, though, it wasn't only the aristocrats who had these noble names that indicated from whom and from where they were from. In a sense, this was the way in which everyone was identified in some ways. So it's by your name identified who you were. So if, I guess I'm safe to say, maybe at Lafayette College there's still some wasps running around. Those good old-fashioned wasp names like Smith or Taylor or Weaver, getting more obscure now, or Cooper, right? Really obscure now, but those of you who like bourbon-flavored beer or something, Coopers are very important because they're the ones who make the barrels. And we could go on, think of all the various names that, again, if you had this name, it wasn't just a random last name that you happened to have. It indicated who you were. You know, if you were the son of Smith, you would be a Smith, and presumably if you married out of the Smiths, you might have a last name like Weaver. It wasn't that you were just taking your husband's last name. You were taking, in a sense, who you were, what your profession was. Right? It's like this old Jerry Seinfeld joke. If you name your child Jeeves, there's a pretty good chance you know what they're going to grow up to be. Right? Not likely to be not, and the same's true of Bozo. Right? Of course, when I discuss these, I'll often use these examples in my classes at Notre Dame, and my students will look at me with great puzzlement. What are these names? What is this thing called a wasp that you're speaking of, Professor Deneen? I teach at Notre Dame. We don't have wasps at Notre Dame. We're the opposite. We're the people who invaded the wasp lands. So I have to refer to different names. There's another way in which you could say that in an aristocratic age, you also indicated that you were of someone, and this was for the lower classes now. This would be you were of Leary, of the home of Leary, and this is a portrait. I'm sorry, go back. This is a picture of Mrs. O'Leary, who famously apparently knocked over a lantern in her barn in Chicago and burned down the entire city. So when I ask my students how many of you have names like O'Leary or McClanahan, another way of saying of, or son of in this case, half or more of my class, and then if I say how many of you have a last name that ends with SKI, the other half of the class will raise their hand. That also means that you're the son of or the child of. Or think of in the Nordic lands, Johansson or Anderson, that all these names indicated who you were from. So when Tocqueville was speaking about the telos of democracy being equal liberty, right, the freedom from other people. He was writing this in a time in which you could say the opposite existed. The very opposite existed. What existed was, in some ways, who you were was defined by whom or from where you came from. Going back a little further, we could say Thomas Aquinas, for example. That meant he was from Aquinas, Aquin, right? And all those names of an earlier age indicated where you were from. So who, where, professions, and so forth. All these last names indicators of who you were in relationship to other human beings. So what happened that Tocqueville in many ways saw this trajectory? We could say there was a revolution, among other things, a revolution in ideas. I think we could point to lots of other reasons, a revolution in economics, a revolution in theology. Since I'm a political theorist, I'll stick with what I know and talk about the revolution, especially in political philosophy. And that revolution, I'll just point to a revolutionary thinker, John Locke. John Locke, if you look up in Wikipedia, which is the source of all knowledge, he is described there as the father of liberalism. He is also sometimes described as America's philosopher, an inspiration to Thomas Jefferson in his writing of the Declaration of Independence, who more or less cribbed Locke's second treatise in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, a really great, tiny little summary of the Declaration of Independence. What Locke proposed was a way of rethinking who we were, how we conceive of ourselves. Right? Again, writing in an age in which you would be defined in many ways by your relationships, to whom and where you were born, the kind of profession you were born into. And what he did was to attempt to redescribe this in a way that wouldn't immediately be seen and transformative, but would, over time, change the way we understood ourselves. And I think it's had a very powerful effect in how we understood ourselves. In order to do this, he had to reconceive of, you could say, human nature itself, that human nature had to be reconceived. And he did this by borrowing from an idea that he had knew of from Thomas Hobbes in his great work, The Leviathan, and the idea of the state of nature and social contract theory. Again, I assume that all of you have had this in AP history or some other course, but just as a very quick review, what Locke proposed was that if we really want to understand our nature, the first thing we have to do is eliminate from our minds, from our sort of self-conception, all of those things that I was just mentioning as having, in some ways, defined who we were. Right? So in a world in which you would, in many ways, your self-understanding would come from all of these formative relationships, ancestry, inheritance, place, and so forth. To reconceive that in a way that made that, in some ways, eliminated that from view. And to propose to think of ourselves in a condition of the state of nature. Right? What is the state of nature? It's a condition in which there's no history. It doesn't occur in any place. There's no culture there that you can point to. There's no religion there that you can say predominates. There's no markers by which you can sort of self-identify. The only thing that we know about ourselves in the state of nature is that we're sort of rational, and particularly we're creatures of instrumental rationality. That we're creatures who will use our instrumental reason to devise ways to secure the goods of life that we might want. And this is very similar to what John Rawls proposed many, many years later in the 20th century, to think of ourselves what he called behind a veil of ignorance, right? Put out of view all the things that you might think are constitutive of who you are, and put yourself behind this veil of ignorance, put those aside, and then again, through using a form of instrumental rationality, think of the kind of society that you would want to be a part of. In doing this, Locke proposed a kind of transformation of our self-understanding. In the first instance, he proposed a redefinition, a new understanding of the nature of freedom and of equality. I actually quote about freedom here, but we can also speak about his understanding of equality. For Locke, freedom, as he puts it here, is the freedom to dispose of our possessions and persons as a person thinks fit. That this is the essence of what freedom is. Now, first thing to notice is that this is a real revolution in the idea of what freedom is. Before this time, freedom would have been along the lines of what St. Paul described as free, or what Plato described as a condition of freedom, which is when we are liberated from the base desires that otherwise impel us, our appetites, the baser appetites of our nature. the things, in a sense, below the belt or below the midsection, right? Our hunger and other things below that region, the kind of instinctive desires that we might have. And that freedom is when you have been liberated from the tyranny of the baser parts of your nature. And this is the same way Plato describes freedom in the Republic, that freedom is the condition of a kind of liberation, the capacity to govern the baser part of your nature. What Locke proposes is that freedom is when you can do the things that you want to do unimpeded by obstacles, particularly obstacles of other people and also nature itself. And that, as Locke understands it, this is the ground condition by which we understand freedom, and in this condition we are equally free. And he says this, I'm just pointing to this, that in this condition none of us is less free than anyone else. And when Tocqueville writes of the telos of liberal democracy being freedom and equality, in many ways he's speaking exactly of this form of freedom and this form of equal freedom, equal liberty to pursue those things that we wish, those things that we desire. Now, this is the ground condition that Locke argues is necessary for us to establish a just and legitimate regime. And this is the encapsulated version of this is in our Declaration of Independence. Right? Our Declaration of Independence, in the famous lines, reads that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson originally wrote free and equal. Benjamin Franklin got out that text a little bit in the revisions, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So again, a slight editing, Locke wrote life, liberty, and property, right, which I think is over in your Kirby building over there. That among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men and derive their just powers from the consent of the people. Right? So in a very encapsulated few sentences, this is basically Locke's argument, that people coming together in a condition of freedom desire to secure their rights, life, liberty, and property for Locke, and to secure these rights we establish governments not to tell us what to do, but to make our rights secure, the rights to pursue life, liberty, and in Locke's case, property. But the problem, in some ways, that Locke immediately confronts is that you can only, in some ways, do the political act, if you're in some senses free in all aspects of life. What good is it to say that we go behind the veil of the state of nature and say that we can consent to a free government if we're still defined by who we are, by our last names, by our relationships to others, by our lineage, by our inheritance, by our places? And so Locke understands that to be truly a person who can be free in the sense of capable of making the free choice of what kind of government, what kind of politics we should have, you have to be free in every respect. One of these ways is, and it's actually a quote from Thomas Jefferson, but he really does derive the logic from John Locke, is first of all that very basic, very American freedom, that kind of essence of Americana. Where would we be without the Western and the road movie, motorcycles, automobiles, right? You know the commercial for the Dodge Charger where George Washington fights the Revolutionary War inside the Dodge Charger. If you don't know it, you should watch it. It's a great commercial, very revealing commercial. I think it's called Cars and Freedom. Is the logo. That one of the things, of course, that Locke understands, and here Jefferson intuiting this, is that that freedom, that this form of freedom that undergirds the freedom, our political freedom, has to be the freedom to move about the world, to be free to move from place to place. And what this in part says is that if you're in a situation, if you're in a condition where you're not enjoying your freedom, whether it's in your family, in the town you happen to be in, even in the nation you happen to be in, that it's a fundamental, as Jefferson says here, right, that it is a fundamental right which nature has given to all men of departing from the country in which chance and not choice has placed them. This is key. Chance and not choice. You go from a world in which Tocqueville is de Tocqueville because that's who he is. It's chance, but it's also fundamentally who he is, to one in which you could say, you're forced to reflect on whether you're going to remain de Tocqueville, whether you're going to remain in some ways defined by that relationship to that place and to that legacy. In some ways, you could say that I think embodied, this is very much part of what we think about when we think of freedom of movement in the American context, thinking about movies. That maybe one of those first great movies of our tradition, The Wizard of Oz. Right? That movie begins with Dorothy expressing her great discontent with living in this unjust place, in this place where no one gets her, which her authentic identity is not allowed to flourish. And as that movie begins, what does she do? She sings a song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. There's a better place than this place. There's somewhere else where I can be, where I think I can live the kind of life that I want to live. Of course, by the end of this movie, again, expressing a deep American paradox, she's saying there's no place like home. This is kind of built into this, is that even as, in some ways you could say, as a philosophy, liberalism institutionalizes discontent. I think that's one way to express it. It sort of makes discontent a kind of basic feature of our lives, always evaluating whether this is the place I want to be. Should I be at Lafayette, or is there a better place I could transfer? I guess I shouldn't say that out loud. Is there some other school where I would be happy, or is there some other city I should be living in? That the same kind of institutionalized discontent about places also leads to a condition in which it's difficult for us to ascertain where home is. Is there a place that we can think of as home? Second, we can think about this in terms of how we relate to each other, not only to our places, but to our people. And then Locke is writing, of course, in a time when you have these deep conflicts, even people killing each other over religious belief. And one of the things Locke wants to do is to, in some ways, introduce the idea that religious belief is really not much different than being a member of a kind of club. I think you're talking about an age in which your religious identity, your identity in a place, in a tradition, are defining of who you are, of your worldview. And he rather redescribes this as a kind of voluntarist society. And again, this keeps in keeping with the idea of consent at the heart of the liberal principle, that you can only be thought to be truly to belong to something if it is a matter of choice and not chance. So you could say it switches a kind of default from one of inheritance to one of choice, to one in which who you are is defined by what you have received as a result of your relationship to others, to one in which if I belong in this particular religion, this particular group, this particular community, it's because I have chosen to belong to this. Even if you have stayed, even if you haven't changed your religion, changed your place, even if you haven't moved away, it's still a result of your choice, not a result of a kind of inheritance. And what's striking about what Locke argues here in his letter concerning toleration is that, again, he lives in an age in which your identity is the result of your inheritance, among other things, of this religious tradition that your parents might have been in. This was one of the reasons for infant baptism. We're going to secure you for our religion. And yet Locke goes on to say that it's an absurd idea that someone would have the view that you can pass on your religion to your child. Because, again, the child hasn't, in some senses, voluntarily chosen that religion. Now, you might be thinking at this point, okay, this is all true, Professor Deneen, about all these groups and about places, but what about that toughest nut of liberalism, the family? And it's part of what we've been thinking about here. In what way can we be thought to be, in some ways, self-defining if who we are is the result of a kind of chance fact that mom and dad happened, to get together in a particular moment, and I happen to be the accidental result of that? What's the logic when we apply this to the family, especially when we know that we don't get to choose our children, and our children certainly know by the age of 5 that they don't get to choose us, much to their regret, much to their often their complaint. One of the things that Locke, it seems to me, he understands this, and that he, again, it seems to me, engages in a kind of redefinition of how we understand our lives with our families. And he has this particular passage. It's a chapter 6 of the second treatise called Of Parental Power. And you could say that in many ways what Locke does is to redefine family relationships along the same line that he has defined political relationships. That at some point you have to consent to the particular regime in which you live. And this is true politically, and it's true in terms of family life. Right? And so what Locke then suggests is that there comes a point Just as it was true for your ancestors in the state of nature, there comes a point in every person's life, right, roughly around you younger people in the room, 18, maybe in his time 16 years of age, once you've reached what he called the age of nonage, age of maturity, that you put yourself into the original condition, into the state of nature, and decide on the terms of the state of nature, am I going to remain in this relationship? Now you might. Your name might be Smith and you're destined to be a Smith. But you only have that destiny because you've chosen it. Whether you recognize it or not, it's a matter of your choice. You have theoretically gone into the state of nature. Again, the default, in a sense, changes from one of inheritance to one of choice. So how is it that we come then to an age in which, among other things, these names that I began with now become fairly arbitrary? Right? In many ways, it's exactly what Tocqueville was predicting, an age in which we would grasp equal liberty as a kind of fundamental basis in which we organize our lives, in which a kind of organized both discontent about whatever happens to be given, and always a question about whether there's something better out there, and a growing view that whatever is given to you is arbitrary. So if we have Weavers today, you younger people won't know this man, but this is Dennis Weaver, who was in a show called Gunsmoke and McCloud. The next figure you might recognize from A Star Is Born and Guardians of the Galaxy. He doesn't appear in Guardians. His voice is in Guardians of the Galaxy. This is Bradley Cooper. As far as I know, he is not a barrel maker. He might be a very good barrel maker if he tried, but this is not his destiny. My favorite one, of course, is Taylor Swift wearing her Notre Dame swag. Her brother was actually a student at Notre Dame. I had him in a class, and I only realized at graduation, oh, he's that Swift. I didn't realize it when Taylor showed up at commencement. So that's why she's wearing Notre Dame swag. I especially like Taylor in this context, because notice how many of what were once defining last names, what you were, have become first names in our culture. Right, so we have a Taylor Swift. When my younger son was little, all of his playmates, like 6 of them, were named Cooper. This became a first name. We also turned places into first names. Colorado or Arizona or Phoenix, right, is a first name. So we have seen then what we have experienced as a civilization is a kind of, you could say, a complete transformation from one way, you could say, radical way of life in which our lives were defined fundamentally and essentially by a kind of relationality, to a way of life in which who we are is defined essentially through the summary, the kind of collection of our choices in the condition of equal liberty. Now, what I want to then suggest is that such individuals are not, as a result, or such human types are not created in nature. They're not actually found in the state of nature. Such human types require, in many ways, a kind of massive architecture, which is the liberal regime. And the liberal regime is a project in many ways that creates the architecture that allows us to live lives of equal liberty, allows us increasingly to realize this telos of equal liberty. And it takes equal parts growth of an increasingly centralized state that makes it possible to be liberated from any identity that we haven't chosen, as well as the growth of an increasingly globalized economic capitalist order. Right? In our politics, we tend to think these two things are opposites. But if we think about this in terms of the liberal regime, what we see is they actually work in tandem and often waxing together. Indeed, over time, what has happened is that we have increasingly realized these lives of living as free individuals or as self-made selves. And that this is far from having been either opposite to statism, the growth of the state, or a consequence of a certain kind of economic system. What we have seen is the growth of a centralized state, of a globalized economic system, and the rise of what we could think of as individualism as all having occurred together, and indeed in tandem, as it must. Right. Now here I could put on my social science hat and show you a lot of really somewhat boring but nevertheless interesting, I guess that's a contradiction, a bunch of graphs and charts. And while I'm skeptical of much of social science as a discipline, I will admit, one of the things it seems to me it's been very good at is measuring connectivity of human beings over time. Now, there are various ways in which you can measure this connectivity, but all the ways in which I've just been speaking about, I think, are ways you can do this. Perhaps the most famous of these findings was originally an article and then a book by Robert Putnam, a political scientist at Harvard University. In 1995, he wrote an article called Bowling Alone, in which he studied basically memberships in associations among Americans. The title comes from the fact that in 1995, what he found that as many people were bowling in 1995 as were bowling 30 years earlier, but far fewer people were bowling in bowling leagues. So that people were bowling, but they were bowling alone rather than as part of bowling leagues. Putnam's book is actually a really extraordinary and impressive collection of an amazing amount of data, all of which shows not random, not arbitrary, but an extraordinarily consistent decline of connectivity between people, especially in the forms of association, forms of memberships and groups. But even things like, I love some of the findings he was able to drum up. How often do you have dinner parties at your home? Having neighbors over and having a sort of a formal dinner party? Or how often, this is something I didn't even know existed until I read his book, how often do you have progressive dinners? You start appetizer in one neighbor's house, you have the main meal in another neighbor's house. Some of you are nodding your head, you know what this is. And then you have the dessert in another neighbor's house, kind of trying to divide up the work, but also traveling in a pack from house to house as you go through the meal. Putnam's book was an extraordinary demonstration of the liberation we've achieved from memberships in groups. We can note also the findings of Putnam and my colleague David Campbell in our liberation from one particular group that would have been definitive of one's identity in an earlier age, the liberty from religion. First of all, the frequency of change of religion, as Locke would have suggested, we choose which religion fits. One of the interesting findings from my colleagues Putnam and Campbell's book, it's called American Grace, is that one of the foremost reasons that people will change religions today is to find the religion that accords most with their political beliefs. So that rather than your religion correcting your politics will correct your religion now, suggesting that the relationship of church and state may have changed a little bit. But what we also see from these studies is the rise of people who are simply liberated from any religion, certainly a religious group. Right? I actually saw somebody with a T-shirt in the airport yesterday. It said, "More Jesus, less religion." Right? The idea. I think you see this in the phrase "I'm spiritual but not religious" is one of the ways that this is expressed. The freedom from institutions. Right? We see increasing liberty from marriage. Right? It's especially generationally. And even some recent studies show even the liberation from partners. People are increasingly likely to live alone. We see decreasing likelihood of people having children. And if you do have children, the likelihood that one will only have one child, thus liberating a generation from the likelihood of experiencing siblings. One of the more striking findings in recent years has been the rise of expressions of loneliness. According to a recent study, 40% of Americans self-report that they are regularly lonely. They experience a sort of existential condition of loneliness, and it seems to me that this may not be disconnected with rising rates of suicide and opioid addiction in our country. And maybe the most poignant of these statistics that I've seen is an increasing liberty from deep friendships. In the 1980s, people reported that they typically would have 3 close friends. That's, finding a close friend is hard, so 3 is not bad. And that today, a vast majority of Americans report they have 1 close friend. Now, if you have 1 close friend and you have a crisis, you have to call them up at 3 a.m. in the morning, which is what you can do if you have a close friend. That person is not going to remain your friend very long if you have a lot of crises in your life and you have to call them often at 3 a.m. It places a lot of burden upon that one really significant friendship. But it's a striking kind of feature. In many ways then, what I want to suggest is that, as I began by suggesting, that we live in a regime that has deeply shaped us, shaped the kind of people that we are. Rather than being this neutral container, it has actually made us increasingly into individuals. It's made us into these creatures that Locke imagines that we are in the state of nature. But you don't find human beings in the state of nature as radically free selves. They have to be made. And they're increasingly made through the great power and the great persuasive power of the liberal regime. It's for these reasons, in some ways you could say the old aristocratic regime, as Tocqueville suggested, the old aristocratic regime fell because in some ways it afforded and maybe in some ways forced a way of life that was unnatural to us. Not having real choice about who we are, not having real choice about the kind of human that we are, the kind of life that we want to lead, is disfiguring. Right? And I think we can see that readily as often as members of a liberal regime. But perhaps we also today live in a regime, and I think we are experiencing a kind of similar crisis because we've gone in some ways to an opposite extreme, in which it's not clear what holds us or binds us together anymore as a society and as a people. So I wanted to conclude by suggesting three quick summaries of what I argue in my book. The first of these, as I just mentioned in passing, is that the liberation of the individual requires a kind of massive architecture. And again, I could go into this in more detail, but this liberation of the individual, far from being natural, has, in particular, requires our capacity to interact with each other through sort of depersonalized agencies, through depersonalized media. A good counterpoint, I was accused in one review of loving the Amish. That was the title of the review. I admire the Amish in lots of ways. I'm not prepared to live like an Amish person. But I find the Amish to offer really sometimes powerful counterexamples to exactly what I'm talking about, so that it's useful. One element that I found fascinating about Amish society is that certain members of Amish religious communities forbid members of that community from taking on insurance. Right? They forbid the purchase of insurance. Right? Imagine going a day without insurance in our society. And the reason for this is that it's believed that insurance is something that destroys the communal basis of that society. And if we think about it, what insurance is a way of managing risk, managing the risk of living life, right? The risk of walking out on the street. And the way that we do that is by pooling our money with a lot of other people that we don't know. And then when something bad happens, you have a car accident, you die, you have an illness, you make a claim. That's literally what it's called, right? You file a claim on that pool, and you say, I need some of this money that we've all contributed to. I'm having a tough day. And if successful, you will receive some compensation for that. And the reason that this Amish communities forbid this is that they believe that when you're living life with all the attendant risks, that you should be able to rely upon and be obligated to the members of your community, that when something bad happens, you have to make them whole. So if your house burns down, you're going to have to spend some Saturdays rebuilding their house. And if a money breadwinner dies too young, it's the obligation of the community to help to raise the children in that family. Now that's a heavy burden to bear, but that's in many ways, you could say, we live in a society in which we attempt as much as possible to create sort of depersonalized forms of relationship through either the state or the market. And notice our big debates recently have been who should run the healthcare system. Is it the state or is it the market? Those are the terms of the debate. But in a liberal society, that's to be expected. It's which depersonalized force and entity is best to negotiate our depersonalized relationship. In many ways, then, what we have experienced in recent years, it seems to me, and what has been one of the manifestations of our politics, is that while our politics has been really directly inspired by this very question, which depersonalized force do we think best allows us to live lives as equal individuals? That's been the terms of the debate. And so one side of our political spectrum says we rely upon the state. And the other side of the political spectrum says we rely upon the market. But what we actually see is a kind of oscillation between the rise of one and the rise of the other. both waxing together, the state becoming increasingly centralized, the economic order becoming increasingly globalized. And in both cases, the result is a greater individuation in all of liberal societies, both European and American. Arguably, Europe is more statist, America is more market-oriented, but the two end up converging in the result being radically individuated human beings. So our debates tend to be between these sides that accuse either the market, right, see Wall Street as the great villain, or the state as the great villain. The two great political movements, it seems to me, of recent years have been two sides of this equation. But what I think is really particularly worth noting is that increasingly the sort of a growing sense that I think underlies a lot of discontent in our politics, in our relationship to the economic order today, that we no longer control the tools of our liberation. Right? These tools of our liberation, an increasingly powerful state, an increasingly globalized economic order, no longer seem to be under our control. And in fact, if you read quite a number of especially in economic literature, they write about this form of globalization essentially as a kind of uncontrollable, right? Almost a determinist kind of a deterministic growth that we ultimately can't control. It's an odd consequence of a regime that comes into being to secure our freedom, in which we say we're basically subject to these forces. Secondly, I suggest that liberalism has failed not because it has not succeeded in being itself, but in fact it has become fully itself, is that if the aim and ambition is to, in many ways, emulate the creatures that existed in the state of nature, to be equally free, then we can equally expect that we are likely to be increasingly in a war of all against all. In creating radically individuated selves, ironically enough, we recreate now through artifice the conditions of the state of nature, in which the main aim and ambition becomes the pursuit of our interests in the name of our liberty, but often and even increasingly at the expense of others. So the great achievement of liberalism is in many ways to convince us that the proper way to relate to other human beings is through a kind of indifference, right? That our main requirement is to be indifferent to the fates of others, and that's how we can leave each other largely free. In fact, if you could go to the next slide, I think this is actually the meaning of John Stuart Mill's. Sorry about this, the Mill series. I hate to criticize the inspiration of the series, but John Stuart Mill, it seems to me, his very definition of liberty. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede efforts to obtain it. In other words, our only obligation to other citizens, our fellow countrymen and other human beings, is to leave them the hell alone. But this, by default, especially in a competitive economic system, becomes a system in which we become, in a kind of, let's say, a subtle way, a form of war of all against all. Lastly, this war of all against all leads to the rise, oddly enough, of a new aristocracy. In other words, the thing that liberalism came into being to combat. One of the very deepest reasons that liberalism comes into being is to overthrow a world in which you're a de Tocqueville because you were born to a de Tocqueville, and you're a Smith because you were born to a Smith, right? In which your place in the social, economic, and political order is defined by your birthright. And rather than have an aristocracy, one of the things liberalism comes into being to do is to replace that now with what we now call a meritocracy. The rise of people in particular who have certain kinds of gifts, certain kinds of abilities to succeed in a competitive world, a world in which they have been liberated from place, from tradition, from custom, from all the kind of relationality that might have not defined an earlier age, now to pursue their own ends in the way that they see fit. With the irony being that increasingly this new meritocracy takes on all of the earmarks of the old aristocracy. It becomes self-perpetuating. It becomes capable of ensuring that the children of this meritocracy will also succeed in this world, and now creating increasingly permanent and immovable class divide that I think was underlie much of the discontents of the last very traumatic election that we've lived through, and I think has still not been adequately grappled, especially by the institutions that form the meritocracy, that is to say the universities, who seem intent on discussing every form of inequality except the inequality that they themselves are perpetuating through their very successful gleaning of the meritocrats and preparing of the meritocrats for future success. So it seems to me that, ironically enough and oddly enough, we're in a condition, in a situation in which we've created this new meritocracy that, again, takes on many of the earmarks of the old aristocracy, but in which the institutions that most loudly proclaim their dedication to equality, the Yales and the Stanfords and so forth, are actually, oddly enough, now a party to and even complicit in the perpetuation of inequality. If you don't know who these are, you should read up on recent events in the admissions world. Now, I put this up, it's a little bit of a laugh line, but it's what we should also recognize is that this recent admissions scandal is really just the logical extension of what has been a very successful ability of people in a position of wealth, position, power, to game a system that they know exactly how to control the outcomes. So we are then in a condition, oddly enough, in which Tocqueville suggested might become our fate, a condition in which we are increasingly freed of each other, increasingly dependent upon an overarching state, a condition in which we are increasingly dominated by materialist thinking and a kind of form of permanent and institutionalized discontent, what he called restlessness, in which he warned would give rise to a new aristocracy that might even be worse than the old aristocracy because it would seem to be more legitimate and therefore less displaceable. But finally, which he said, we might have a chance of combating if we could resist the likelihood or the possibility of liberalism, what he called democracy, what we call liberal democracy, becoming fully itself. If we could retain the kind of practices and even institutions that would ward off this movement toward this radical atomization of our society, and as a consequence also the radical statism and the radical materialism that we're experiencing today. As I suggest in the book, liberalism has failed because liberalism has succeeded. The problem is that Tocqueville didn't give us a volume 3, which he might have entitled Break in Case of Emergency. So in many ways, it's up to us to think through what might be the kinds of Tocquevillian remedies for our time in which we seem to have so many fewer resources as correctives as Tocqueville believed we had a century ago. And for that, I would love to hear a little bit more about your own response to my analysis of our condition and whether there's any hope. So thank you very much for your attention.
Mill thinks that individuals should be free to act as they see fit as long as they don't infringe on the similar liberties of others. That doesn't imply to me that one should not decide by one's own lights to serve others in need. In other words, you could buy into the Millian conception of negative freedom, but still decide as a personal matter that it's very important to you to serve those in your community. So I guess I want to understand a little better why that liberal conception of freedom, in your view, inexorably leads to a society composed of people who don't want to serve others. So, and then related to that, because an alternative explanation of the atomization of our society would just be affluence and technological change. Whereas you seem to be putting a lot of the explanatory weight or emphasis on liberal ideology. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. I can and have given entire 2-hour-long lectures on John Stuart Mill, so I won't subject you to all of my interpretations of John Stuart Mill. Let me just say the following about Mill. Since the series is named for Mill. I don't have a lot of fondness for John Stuart Mill. And the odd thing is that the people who have the most fondness for John Stuart Mill today tend to be conservatives. Right? It's actually not liberals anymore who like John Stuart Mill. If you look at what's happening on college campuses today, it's people like Professor Robert George, a noted conservative figure at Princeton University, who are invoking John Stuart Mill all the time. And even this this speaker series invokes John Stuart Mill as an opportunity for us to hear different voices. Right? So it tends to be on college campuses and various other venues, Mill, who's now the hero, especially for those of a more conservative disposition, whereas in an earlier generation it would have been liberals who would have preferred John Stuart Mill. So we're in this odd situation. The reason I tend to be very suspicious of John Stuart Mill is that, like Tocqueville, he sees the dangers of, especially of tyranny of the majority. Right? In fact, he writes a very glowing review of Democracy in America, the first volume of Democracy in America. Now, where Tocqueville said that the danger of tyranny of the majority especially manifests itself when people become atomized. They no longer feel like they can have a sort of kind of communal forms of engagement that allows them to be able to gather together and to even speak up against what they see as this imposing tyranny, this imposing sort of mass democratic despotism. Mill sees tyranny of the majority especially manifest in the kinds of traditions and customs that were below the level of politics. Right? So Mill begins on liberty by suggesting that liberalism has been very successful, sort of Locke's project especially of constraining political power, of limiting political power, of making political power legitimate, has been successful. But the problem is that people are still governed by custom. People are still governed by the power of what he sees as the sort of the shaping force of custom. And for Mill then, the real project becomes how do we break up what he calls the despotism of custom. And part of breaking up the despotism of custom is especially to liberate people, in the first instance by allowing them to say and act in whatever the way they wish, right? Defending the rights of people to speak and act in whatever way they wish, as long as no one is being harmed in the process. And this has the ultimate effect of, in some ways you could say, of moving legitimate state power merely as a kind of neutral, non-judgmental force to one that will increasingly have to be used to go after the non-liberative aspects of culture. Right? The state becomes an active force in seeking to undermine the power of the sort of cultural formation. So that in an odd way, Mill begins to justify a kind of use of government power in the kind of direction of now forcing people to be free, of liberating people from what he sees as the despotism of culture. I think further, I think, as I said during the lecture, in his argument about the use and purpose, especially of the freedom of speech, the freedom of what he calls experiments in living, it's in some ways you could say it's an effort, especially to liberate people to a kind of condition of indifference. So you're right that one can, as a kind of private matter, still be concerned with others. But you could say this argument has a powerful shaping force in a world in which we increasingly see our lives as the result of the sum of our decisions, the sum of our choices. One of the hallmarks of the meritocracy, it seems to me, is on the one hand a kind of a stated devotion to social justice, but on the other hand a kind of deep-seated belief that I have achieved this position through my efforts. Right, through the hard work that I have undertaken. The kind of atomization and fragmentation that I think the Millian philosophy in many ways introduces, advancing Locke's philosophy, is in many ways to begin to shatter the ways in which we understand how our position is so deeply reliant upon the efforts of so many other people, right? And begin to see our own achievements or our lack of achievements, to blame ourselves for our shortcomings. So I think that there's a very deeply shaping force that the Millian philosophy introduces. It's not that it eliminates the possibility of people acting upon less selfish interests. It's just that it tilts the default in that direction. And we could say that it's a great thing that people can choose whether or not they're going to be in a certain kind of customary society or so forth. It's also the case that it tends to be people who I'll give you some more social science data. This is from Arthur Brooks in a study, who used to be the president of AEI, now going up to Harvard. One of the things that Brooks discovered is that those who are most likely to engage in philanthropy, like personal forms of philanthropy, either giving money or giving time, tend to be people who go to church regularly. In other words, it's going somewhere and being reminded constantly you should be giving to other people. It's not just having good sentiment, it's actually having institutional forms that constantly remind you to do acts of charity that are likely to prompt you to do acts of charity. And this book that he wrote on charitable giving and the charitable offering of time is a kind of reminder that merely good feeling without, in some ways, institutional forms may not be sufficient. You're absolutely right. I do have, I suffer from something that some people call Weaverism, attributed to Richard Weaver, who wrote a book called Ideas Have Consequences. In Richard Weaver's view, everything started to fall apart with William of Ockham in the 12th century. That the real source of modern troubles dates back to the 11th, 12th century. And but for William of Ockham, everything would be fine. Now, you might, this is ridiculous, and yet here I am arguing that if only John Locke and John Stuart Mill hadn't made these arguments, we would be fine. I would be the first to, of course, agree that what we could say is this powerful, I think broadly speaking, this powerful force of modernity. Sometimes we could encapsulate all of these things: the prosperity, the economic system, the technological transformations, frankly, the theological revolution that takes place in the 15th, 16th century. I mean, we could describe this in a whole variety of ways. In the interest of the division of labor, I think my preferred way, and indeed my own expertise, inclines me to think especially of the way in which the transformations in political philosophy reflect the direction and trajectory of modern society. But I'll also appeal to the authority of someone who at least I regard as authoritative, which is Aristotle. And Aristotle describes politics, the study of politics and the practice of politics. He calls it the architectonic science. By that he means it's the science that's in some ways most fundamental because it shapes our shared world. It shapes how it is we live our lives together. And it further shapes, in some ways, how we understand all the other human forms of organization, family, economy, and so forth. This architectonic science, understanding the architectonic science is a way into understanding many of the deeper forces that shape the modern world. I have a chapter in the book on technology. And one of my arguments in that chapter is that depending in many ways on the kind of society that you have, at the deepest level, the kind of politics that one has, will in many ways determine not just whether you'll have certain kinds of technologies, but how you will in many ways deploy those technologies, how those technologies will be used. I mentioned Wilson Carey McWilliams earlier. One of the first pieces of writing that I read as a freshman in a course with McWilliams was an essay called From Porch to Patio. It's a great little essay on the transformation of the American home, which had been typically built with a front porch and became increasingly built with a back patio. That we moved increasingly to a building style that emphasized sociability, right? The fact that you wanted to have a kind of intermediary space between the private part of the home and the public sidewalk where your neighbors might walk in front of your house. And that especially in the after the Cold War, after World War II and during the Cold War era, that form of building disappeared by and large. And instead what replaced it was the back patio where people could live lives that were much more private. The desire was to drive into your garage and not have to see any other human being. Now we don't think about this as technology. This is technology. This is something that human beings make. And it doesn't just relate a change in building style, it reflects a change in the way that we see ourselves and see our relationship to other human beings. I think we need to think more broadly about technology in this sense, to see that technology isn't just the little device that you have. Technology is everything that human beings make. And if I'm right, maybe the ground technology is our political order, because how we order our politics will have a powerful shaping effect on the ways in which we'll use the technologies that we happen to develop. It's not inevitable that our technology has to be atomizing in a lot of ways. So anyway.
I don't know that I disagree with you, but I'll disagree in part. You made a big leap from Locke to bowling alone, so there's a lot, 300 years in between there. So, but just following up on bowling alone, I mean, in the days when people bowled together, white guys bowled with white guys, black guys, if they bowled at all, bowled with black guys, women served the snacks at the bowling alley. So, you know, in terms of centralization, it seems to me we really needed centralization to compel desegregation in the southern states. And so the promotion of equality also promoted liberty for African Americans, liberty for women and equality, and then, you know, other groups thereafter. So it seems to me you're pointing to a kind of golden age, which was very problematic, had its own set of problems, and that what we have at present, many of these issues you're pointing to may be here, but there are other issues that make it more complex and nuanced, and particularly we have a society now in which increasingly people of all colors and sexual orientation and gender and so on have a lot more freedom and equality than they had in the past, which strikes me as being a pretty good thing. Now that may contribute to the kind of alienation you're talking about or distancing of people, but that would seem to be very much an upside of this. And so I wonder how you look at that.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, that's an important question. You know, as I said, I use those data points as ways, and you're right. Of course, I'm making a pretty big leap, and part of that is for the interest of time, but also part of that is really to suggest that part of what we have been seeing is the outworking of a certain logic within liberal philosophy, and again, we could point to economics and so forth. I'm not saying it's entirely because of this, you know, one philosopher or several philosophers. That this outworking took time, right? That the outworking of this logic took several centuries, and I think it has accelerated in the last number of years. And I think social science data backs this up. So that I think that there's a reason to think that there's a connection between the philosophical, economic, social order and the trajectory in which we're seeing. And you're quite right that one of the compelling reasons for the kind of dislodging of people, right, the liberation of people, goes all the way back to Locke, which is I don't want to be defined by some kind of ascribed identity. In some ways, it's no different, right, to say that the ascribed identities that might have existed in the late Middle Ages were as confining as the ascribed identities that people have experienced in more recent years, and more and more people are claiming the liberation from those ascribed identities. So that's absolutely consistent with, it seems to me, this logic. I'm not suggesting, and I don't want to be taken as suggesting, what we really need to do is go back to 1950 or 1200 or whatever. Pick your year that seems to be ideal. It seems to me that where we are is having embraced a kind of philosophical, political, economic order that aimed to do one thing. Having done that, we have really in some ways created a condition in which we've overshot the mark in some ways, in just the way that it seems to me a much too confining world overshot the mark. That, in the spirit of the Aristotelian mean, how is it that we can in some ways retain what we, I think, recognize as some of the genuine achievements of liberalism? And I end the book by saying, look, there are some genuine achievements here, without following its internal logic to its completion, which it seems to me to be leading at least to as harsh an inegalitarian world as in many ways is the one that we celebrate having left behind. It seems to me that we should be extremely worried about the economic stratification, the stratification of social class, the stratification of potential life experience, that's increasingly going to be reserved for a tiny portion of our population as we begin to technologically transform the workforce. So I think that there's a danger of a sort of self-congratulation in what we have achieved without recognizing its attendant costs. And so I think as a As a political community, to the extent that we are a political community, it seems to me that right now is a very important time for us to reflect on in what ways can we seek to rebind some conception of a common civic project. What would be the possibility of imagining that in a world in which the resources for that have declined? Not by reinventing them necessarily, but by reimagining and rethinking them. And here I actually think that our universities, our colleges and universities could potentially have a very key place to play in this, as they always do. But I think that they're, at this moment, not very well equipped for that, because I do think that they're in the midst of a kind of strong sense of self-congratulatory sense of egalitarianism at a time when they have become engines of advancing forms of institutionalized inequality. So I take all of those reservations very seriously, and I agree. And I think it's not a question of going back, it's a question of sort of where do we go forward from here. This is potentially a time of some interesting political possibilities. I think there's really an interesting possibility of a kind of a realignment that takes some parts of what we have thought about as the traditional left and the traditional right. I think the protest movements that I threw up there, while apparently opposite, actually have a lot in common. Whether they see that, I think, is an interesting question. But in speaking to many people, one of the odd things was that I not only got a shout out from Archbishop Chaput. I think are we in the Philadelphia diocese here? I'm not the guy. Okay, no, we're not. Okay, my book got a shout out from probably the most traditionalist and conservative archbishop in the United States. But I also got a shout out from President Obama in his summer reading. I think that there really is a possibility at this moment of for various reasons and various discontents, the breakdown of a kind of civic society, of the formation of families and communities, and an economic order that seems deeply atomizing, of something potentially good coming out of these conversations. It's not a question of going back, it's a question of how we move forward, but with due caution and necessary recognition.
Hi, thanks again for coming to speak tonight.
Can you tell me who you are?
I'm Ed Carl, I'm a freshman here. You talk about conceptualizing a new way forward, and I guess I'm wondering what sorts of cultural institutions might take the place of what we have lost to liberalism. Mm-hmm. Off the top of my head, I might think of organized religion as, I guess, a different potential social focus, mm-hmm. but at this point that doesn't seem like the kind of structure we could return to. Mm-hmm. So what proposals, if any, do you have for a new path?
Well, it's a very great question. That's all three of these are fantastic questions that, in many ways, have proven to be the stickiest wickets. In other words, it's a lot easier to do the critical analysis than to propose the project that should follow. I think on the one hand, I have found it very interesting that, just to go back to this question of sort of, this kind of interesting possibility of a political realignment, you've had in the last year several very recognizable conservative figures criticizing aspects of the free market. And I hesitate to mention his name because I know he's a non-person now, but Tucker Carlson had an entire monologue earlier in the year in which he decried, in terms very familiar to anyone who's read the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, decried the kind of the ways in which capitalism dissolves all social organizations. The famous line, all that is solid melts into air. Everything is turned into a commodity. Everything is tradable, right? All aspects of life become commodified, valued by a certain monetary number. And this now we can see this in things like, organ donations, and human life itself is now monetized. You see, as well, the current editor of the journal First Things, Rusty Reno, has also written pretty widely read and discussed editorial article on one of the great challenges for conservatives today being the kind of atomizing force and commodifying force of modern capitalism. What I would really like to see are people on the left being concerned about the forms of civil society, starting with the family and the breakdown of the modern family, community forms of life, frankly, not being as hostile to religion as I think they have become. It's not necessarily that you have to necessarily laud it and support it, but not being nearly as hostile. I think if that were a possibility, you would have a remarkable potential gathering of people who would have a lot to talk about. And so it would be not that you would be pointing to where in society you would say that's going to be rebuilt. It would be rather what would be the ways in which you might alter aspects, especially of our economic order, our political order, to strengthen local organizations and local forms of life. I think in particular, how can you, I think an interesting and growing interest on both some elements of the left and the right in anti-monopolistic practices and pursuits. How can you begin to break up some of the very powerful economic concentrations that we see in our country today? And this might have the effect, among other things, of allowing more room for the growth of smaller businesses, which has been traditionally one of the places where, in a certain way, you can create value in many different communities throughout a society such as ours. People who are able to create businesses not merely working for Goldman Sachs in New York City, but can open up law firms in small towns and hamlets around the country, become the kind of caretakers and the trustees of those kinds of communities in ways that I think has ceased to be the case. So I can't say, I don't want to say in advance that this is what it will look like, but I do think we can begin to talk about what would be the conditions that are today so destructive of the formation of where it is we can find some forms of common ground and relationality. And if you change those conditions, maybe those forms will arise in new ways that we might find to be quite helpful. So that's a little bit of a dodge, but also I think a realistic response. Did that satisfy your? Okay, good. Oh, thanks.
My question might be.
Can you tell me who you are?
Oh, hi. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a senior.
Okay.
My question is probably a good springboard. I'm glad I'm actually not the first and the third. So you talk about the lack of non-political communities such as church and bowling clubs. Do you think that political groups or even groups based on a sort of intersectional tribalism is actually becoming a new religion? With that being said, is this a dangerous thing? In my opinion, it is a bad thing because it allows people to dehumanize others with whom they disagree with, much like a religious zealot might do to a non-believer.
Yeah. Well, I think going back to this gentleman's question, there's of course a lot of reason for anger and a claim for justice among many groups that would identify as intersectional. And I think that one thing that if there is intersectionality, which I think is a problematic category because it assumes that people are all like-minded in many ways, it's that there's a shared sense that we have suffered a grievous injustice. I think, though, as we'll begin to see playing out over time, we're already seeing there are ways in which there are actual differences between various of these groups. We're seeing this between feminist and trans community, for example, in ways. In sports especially, right? And I think other areas we're going to see that as well. So I think that there's questions about how much of this is likely to remain a powerful force. I guess to go back to something I was saying earlier, I think one of the reasons that especially these forms of diversity have been so embraced, especially by our elite institutions, especially higher education, is that it allows for, in addition to, of course, the seeking to redress historical injustices, it also allows for the inclusion and therefore the claim of a certain commitment to egalitarianism that leaves intact the meritocratic order. Right? It leaves it, in fact, perfectly intact. It leaves it, in fact, in some ways immune from questioning. It acts as almost a form of self-deception at some level, a kind of a veil that allows institutions, I'll give you an example, institution where I used to teach, Princeton University, the dean of students of Princeton University, when speaking about social clubs that had historically been exclusive, right, had interviewed students about whether or not they could be included. The dean of students at Princeton University, in a quote to the New York Times, said, "There's no place for elitism on the Princeton campus." Right? For someone at Princeton to make that claim, right, is to be completely oblivious to where you are and what you're doing. And I think that's the danger of the way in which the claims to equality have been especially incorporated in our, let's say, our elite-forming institutions. So I agree with you at one level that I think there's a kind of, there's a danger involved in a kind of self-certainty that makes, the thing we talk about constantly as being essential on college campuses, which is critical thinking. It actually forestalls a certain kind of critical thinking. And then to the heart of your question, there has been, I think, certainly an attendant form of assertiveness and self-certainty that has forestalled and made it difficult to have often intellectual conversations, intellectual debates, especially on college campuses where this should be prized. And here I'll give a shout out to John Stuart Mill, and actually the quote that you began with. I do think that if we are to have kind of million institutions, above all, they should be our universities. And there is a kind of, oddly enough, there's a kind of new assertion that circumscribes speech on college campuses that looks a lot like the kinds of circumscribed forms of speech that people used to criticize Catholic universities for. Right? That Catholic universities in the 1950s were considered to be not intellectually serious and rigorous places because they circumscribed what you could say, what you could read, what you could believe. What's happening now on college campuses that are secular? They are far more certain about what needs to be circumscribed than we are at Notre Dame. Right? We have lots of disagreement. We have people who are pro-life, we have people who are pro-choice, we have people against gay marriage, we have people who go for gay marriage. I've had colleagues leave institutions like Stanford and Harvard because they believe Notre Dame is where they can be at a place that has academic freedom. So I think it's a great irony that we live in a world, a kind of post-million world, in which it's the secular institutions that presumably are supposed to be the great bearers of the tradition of free inquiry, in which you find in many ways the most difficult and challenging places to have certain questions and debates today. So in that sense, I think it may oddly enough be a kind of new assertion of a quasi-religion in a way that there's a true belief and then there's a kind of heresies. I appreciate that.
Hi, I'm Elias. One of my questions is, I guess, going off of like what to do in the future. I'm wondering if you have what your thoughts, if any, are on like the project that's going on in the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria currently.
Wow, this is a first. I've heard a lot of questions in the last year. This is a first.
It's a far cry from America, but of something that's like completely different than the liberal democratic order.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to tell me a little bit, and I'll probably have to punt because I simply do not know.
Okay, then we can switch the topic.
Okay.
But I mean, I was glancing at your Wikipedia page, and I saw like Christian communitarianism, and so this is another form of communitarianism.
Okay.
That's sort of like, I don't know, it heavily emphasizes like associations and sort of all the way on while also emphasizing equality. So maybe if...
Yeah. So I do have to say that in various... I've been giving a lot of talks since the publication of this book, and I have learned a lot about a lot of, in some ways, efforts in a lot of different places in the world to form, in some ways, these kinds of ways of life that seem to be, at least in part, reactions against a kind of atomizing globalization. One of my other teachers in graduate school was a man named Ben Barber. He wrote a book called Jihad versus McWorld many, many years ago. It did pretty well when it was published around 2006, 2007, maybe a little later. 1995, 1996. And then it jumped into the bestseller list in 2001 after the attacks of 9/11. It described in many ways a kind of what he saw as a dangerous dynamic that was developing in the modern world. On the one hand, kind of what I've been talking about is McWorld. In other words, a kind of globalized, commodified economic political order that saw itself as universal, as applying everywhere without exception, as in some ways you could say this was Bush II's doctrine about invading Iraq, was to make them a liberal democracy because it's the only legitimate regime. This lie behind Francis Fukuyama's argument in The End of History, that this is the end station of all politics. And that one of the responses to this form of McWorld was jihad, was the rise of efforts to combat it, especially through sometimes militant anti-liberal forms. And maybe in some ways that's part of what we're seeing occurring around the world today in the rise of sort of populist reactions against this McWorld. It might be simply the newest iteration of this. It seems to me what we really need to find is, are there ways to avoid these twin perils?
Right. I mean, it is an attempt. They're fighting both.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where I think, and I really do want to say that I find that a lot of my students and I think you are looking at, are there other examples? Are there ways that people have been able to configure this, not only in the United States, which is what I know best, but other parts of the world that we can learn from? And here I think, all to the better that we should be able to look elsewhere. Because it seems to me that it's quite right that Ben Barber was in many ways correct about this, that otherwise we're potentially caught in a kind of a cycle of sort of extreme reactions from McWorld to jihad, unless we devise sort of ways of life that avoid the pitfalls of both of those. So I would love to learn more. Maybe afterwards you can teach me a little bit. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a junior. I wanted to ask, you mentioned the bowling alone stuff, the suicide rates, loneliness, all the litany of depressing statistics that you see everywhere. But one of the things, we often talk about these as societal problems, but like I first came across this a couple days ago. There was an article in the New York Times about the loneliness of the poor, and it talked about how in poor retirement homes that are underfunded, they use robots to substitute for human companionship. But in the homes of the wealthy and the lives of the wealthy, people are increasingly less technological. In Silicon Valley, they're teaching their kids to play with blocks. Among the college-educated, rates of marriage, of community involvement are as high as they've ever been. Rates of divorce are lower than they've ever been. So if all these social problems, these terrible ills are confined to the middle and increasingly lower middle classes, then why isn't the solution just more wealth?
Yeah. That's fantastic question. And you're absolutely right. Once we begin to disaggregate this data that, again, I was summarizing pretty quickly, you're absolutely right that it turns out that those at the upper, those who are the new aristocracy are actually doing relatively better, in fact, relatively well in a lot of these measures. Certainly better than a lot of people in the lower and lower middle class. Where we see, if we were to revert to another non-person, to the work of Charles Murray in his book Coming Apart, which I think is a book that it's unfortunate that college campuses have been protesting him, because college campuses need to hear about the findings of that book. Because what Murray really does relate is this growing divide that's geographic, socioeconomic, but most fundamentally the expectation of certain kinds of life, the potentials for a flourishing life that really has now begun to take on the form of class differentiation. And the most recent book that I've read that really explores this as well, it's a book by a journalist named Tim Carney called Alienated America. And it's, again, really, it's a terrific study, especially focused on the counties that voted for Donald Trump, that it really was, especially because of this kind of social devastation that was being experienced. Now, I think this is in the view of many on the left, that it's a material question. It's a question of material access to material conditions. I think that's maybe a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And one thing we could say is that, again, not to be nostalgic, but in economic conditions in many ways worse than the ones we're experiencing now in the 1920s, 1930s during the Great Depression, we didn't see the same kind of sort of devastation of family life and the kind of the devastation of the capacity of people to form stable relationships. If anything, it was in many cases fairly stable communities that helped people get through some of the worst parts of the Great Depression. So it's not merely an economic and material question. I think a lot has to do, among other reasons, because of what has become a geographic sorting in the country today. I've been critical of our institutions of higher learning. One of the things that our institutions of higher learning do, it's not on purpose, it's just simply a part reflecting the economy that we have, is they're engaged in the book, I describe this as a giant strip mining operation. If we think about what strip mining is, you go to places where there's good material, you strip it away from that place, you send it to somewhere where it can be processed, so it's now useful and productive in the economy. It goes that place, it never goes back, and what do you leave behind? You leave a pretty devastated landscape behind when you finish the strip mining operation. Well, this is what institutions of higher learning, all the places I've taught, Princeton, Georgetown, Notre Dame, this is what we do for human beings. We find the most talented people in all the little hamlets and towns in the world, not only the United States, but the whole world. We process them, and then we send them. I used to say we send them to one of 5 cities in the world, and I had a student at Georgetown once raised his hand and said, "What are the other 2?" So apparently only 3 cities in the world that are worth living in. And what do we leave behind? We leave behind pretty devastated landscapes, right? We leave behind places that none of us would want to move back to because there's no culture, there's no decent coffee, there's not a good restaurant. And I think as a result, one of the reasons for the devastation of these communities, if you take away all the talented sort of, the kind of cream of the crop of these places, what's left? Who become the kind of stewards of these communities? If you go to all these little communities, I'm sure it's true here in Easton, and you see that, probably some of the buildings, and probably, this building over here, what is it? Kirby Hall, right? Mr. Private Property. Kirby Hall, but a good example of local philanthropy, of people having, really given back to the communities. What would this institution be without the Kirby family having donated substantial resources in the making of this place? And what happens when all those people end up going to New York, Washington, San Francisco, and so forth? Are they likely to support their local places? So one of the things I would really like to see is, and this might be one way that adjustments in our economic order might encourage people to begin thinking about some places other than New York, Washington, and so forth, to revive the vitality of the many places in our country, places that were very vital. I've been actually very fond of our mayor, who's doing quite well in the presidential pre-primary season, Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Now I'm less fond of him now because he wants to leave, but this was a guy who went out, got a Rhodes Scholarship, went to Harvard, got a Rhodes Scholarship, and then he came home and ran for mayor. And he's been enormously helpful to the city of South Bend. He's done such an enormous good to that city, and if more people would consider not just how much money you'll make and the good coffee you'll get in New York, but how much good you could do in places that aren't as scintillating and exciting. How much genuine good you could do because you're extraordinarily talented and you have energy and an abundance of good ideas. In a way you can impact those communities that you will never impact New York City or Washington, D.C. I think it would be for the good of the country. So I think there are certainly economic reasons, but I think there are deeper social forces that are at play, and I would say one of those has been the sort of stripping of those communities of a kind of a strata of people who might have really served as kind of stewards and caretakers of those places.
Could I just ask a brief follow-up? It seems like you're endorsing, for example, a massive program of rural investment, set up a university in every in every South Bend in the country. That seems like a lot less sort of philosophically profound than this 5,000 or 300, I should say, not 5,000 year critique of liberalism. So do you think there are technocratic fixes to these problems? Because Mayor Pete, I'm sure, has done a good job.
Yeah.
He brought up, there's a university there. You can shift social incentives to some extent with economic incentives. You give every American who moves back to their hometown a free student loans or
Right.
$100,000. So, do you think there are technocratic solutions to these problems?
Well, I think, in some ways, interestingly, I mean, these are I'm trying to offer the beginnings of changing certain kinds of ways in which we, by default, act, because we act as these liberated equal selves who shape our own futures by the sum of our choices. And you can change incentives, and in this kind of slow way, you can change the way in which people might respond to those incentives. Now, there's two tracks here, right? Part of this is rethinking sort of what it is, what kind of world we want to see. That's a big philosophical project, right? That's the Lockean, Hobbesian project, right? And I think that's something that's happening. I actually think this is a really extraordinary time for political philosophy, not just as a, kind of an academic discipline, but actually to think through the kind of crisis of our moment. But then there's always going to be, how do you get from point A to point B or point Z? Let me say point A to M maybe, and you don't start with L. You start with B and C. So what in some ways, what do you need to do to get closer to point M? You have to move incrementally towards some vision of a kind of society that you might envisage. And that might look sort of modest and technocratic. But I do think that in many ways, going back to I think the earlier question, how does one begin to conceive or reconceive how we might think about ourselves in this kind of connectivity with others, and especially beginning to rethink the kind of meritocratic or new aristocracy that we've created. So, one suggestion I've, since President Trump now seems as interested in using the government largesse to universities to force them to do certain things as President Obama did, why don't we begin saying, when you open up a campus in China, you open up a campus in Saudi Arabia, you open up a campus in Paris, you have to open up a campus somewhere in your state that's in this socioeconomic strata, right? And offer, and a certain number of those slots have to be to people who are in that local community. Right. So I just think that there are ways that we could begin to rethink some of these questions that look like they're maybe somewhat modest. I mean, I don't think Harvard would think that was modest, but to move us in a somewhat different direction that has a trajectory that might be, unforeseeably quite transformative. Anyway, but yeah, great, thank you.
Thanks.
You said I could be here until I wanted to, and how about if we make this the last question? Yeah, I know. Make it good.
You seem in a lot of your talks, you articulated brilliantly that they're like the advantages of more small local communities and more small local institutions. But I would argue that one of the advantages of liberalism that has come up is peace. Things like the European Union, like a historically conflict-driven region, has become largely peaceful. There's some interstate conflicts, but for the most part, it's a lot more peaceful than it used to be. And I would also argue, following through that, only using that as an example, that an inherent consequence of forming more localized group and more localized communities is that there generally has to be conflict, because she kind of said that, or touched on this before, but it does, at least to some extent, create an us versus them mentality when you don't liberate yourself from things like nation, state, class, whatever. Not necessarily class, sorry, nation, state, religion, whatever. Do you see a future in which we could maintain these local communities but still separate ourselves from the potential conflict that might follow?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I saw a really interesting, I guess not really graph, but a piece of data. Recently, a friend of mine posted it. By age, how many years, what percentage of your life the United States has been at war? And anyone under the age of about 30, the United States has been at war more or less 100% of your lives. For me, Professor Miller, about 50% of our lives. We did have a little bit of peace there in a couple of years of our lives. What you're describing as a time of extraordinary peace in Europe has to a considerable extent been a gift of the United States essentially acting as the world's policeman, acting as the peacekeeper, ensuring the free, safe flow of energy, right, from the Middle East, among other things. If you want to read more about this, the person to read, in my view, is Andrew Bacevich, who's a professor of military history at Boston University, who was a full-blown, head-on, ardent supporter of Ronald Reagan in 1980, a critic of Jimmy Carter for his weak policies, especially regarding the Middle East, who thought he was kind of soft when he got up in 1979, and said that in order for us not to become beholden to the Middle East and forced in many ways to perpetuate wars there for the foreseeable future, we were all going to have to turn down our thermostats to 65 degrees. And he got up in the Oval Office and wore a cardigan when he gave the speech and saying, this is how we need to dress in our homes. We can't be wearing shorts in December and sweatshirts in July in our homes. This is not a good way to live our lives because we're making ourselves dependent on these foreign powers. And when the polls showed that Americans hated this message, he changed his tune and within 9 months declared that the Middle East was an American vital interest, an AVI. And this has become American policy now for the last 50 years or so. So we've been at war for 50 years. So the idea that liberal democracies are always at peace and that everything is well, in many ways Europe has been allowed and has benefited from the war-making of the United States. And again, I would recommend to read Bacevich. He has a book called The War of the Greater Middle East, in which he, I think, understands that all the various wars that we think about as separate, Afghanistan, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, and Syria and so forth, are really all just one war, and the longest war we fought in American history. But all that is to say that I don't think the age of the nation state is over. If anything, it seems to me that what we're seeing is the kind of reassertion of the idea that the nation state is how many people in an advanced liberal society find their identity, right? How they see their identity. And among other things, it has been the guarantor of the rights of liberal individuals. I do think that we're in the midst of reassessing the nation state and its role. And the question will be, is there another political form that might be the guarantor of these rights? But notice that as we centralize more, as more and more the role and function of politics moves to ever more distant entities, the more discontent the citizenry becomes. Because the theory that we control the government, the idea behind liberal democracy, that we ourselves, right, are determining the ends and purposes of government, bumps into and slams against the actual practice in which our ability to control those now distant and increasingly large and bureaucratic structures, in fact, are not terribly responsive to the citizenry. And so many of the discontents you're seeing throughout Europe today, obviously Brexit, and many of the countries that are becoming restive under the European Union, I think are indications that we're not there. And I think we're unlikely to get there very soon.
The difference between the European Union and obviously pretty much everywhere else is that the European Union, at least to some extent, they've all liberated themselves from traditional national boundaries, right? And as you stated, there's a lot of discontent that goes with that. There's a lot of bureaucratic BS that kind of follows through. But I don't think you can make the claim that Europe is a more violent place now than it would have been without the European Union.
No, all I'm saying is that in many ways the European peace is a dividend of American war making.
Right, but like when you use the Middle East as an example, they haven't liberated themselves from that more traditional like Westphalian national borders yet.
Yeah.
Do you think that would
there
change
again,
anything?
I think that question is far from settled. You know, as we can see in contemporary European politics, we're seeing a real reassertion of nationalism, various forms of deep discontent with the European Union, and in many ways, it's not unlike what, of course, we're seeing in the United States. So, what's surprised me most about the reception of my book is how many readers overseas are interested in it. It's being translated into 14 languages, and I said it not to brag, but to be just kind of amazed that this analysis that really was, as my presentation suggested, was really written with an American audience in mind, is speaking to the anxieties of people throughout the liberal democracies of the Western world. So I think what we're seeing is this phenomenon playing itself out, not only in the traditionally Lockean million countries of Britain and the United States, but the more Rousseauian social democratic countries of Western Europe. So it's a broader problem of kind of liberalism in all of its iteration and its philosophical forms that seems to be converging, bringing Europe and the United States, England into the same kind of crisis, and suggesting that all of these various forms of liberalism are undergoing the same kind of contortions and deep discontents at the same moment. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time to be interested in politics, even as it's a very discomforting time to be a citizen of liberal democracy. And so we'll leave it there. So.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.